They say the elevators never stop moving in Hive Secundus, that the great iron cages have been ascending and descending through the city's vertical kilometers for so long that stopping them would be like stopping a man's heart, catastrophic, final, impossible to restart. I believed that once, back when I was new to the job, when I still thought I understood what it meant to operate one of these ancient machines. Now, after 32 years of riding the same shaft between levels 47 and 93, I know the truth is worse than any simple metaphor. The elevators don't stop because they can't stop, because something in their machinery has transcended mere mechanical function and entered a state that exists somewhere between operation and obsession. And we operators, we're not controlling them, we're feeding them. My name was Aldrich Men, though I haven't used it in so long that it feels like something I read in a personnel file once, a designation attached to someone else's life. Down here in the shafts, names are dangerous things, too specific, too individual. The elevator doesn't care about names, it cares about weight and timing and the precise rhythm of gates opening and closing, about the flow of bodies from one level to another, about maintaining the circulation that keeps the hive's population distributed according to the administratum's incomprehensible formulas. I am Operator 17 now, have been for longer than I was ever Aldrich, and the number suits me better anyway. Numbers are clean. Numbers don't carry memories of who you used to be before the shaft claimed you. I came to the job the way most operators do, through a combination of desperation and bureaucratic accident. I'd been working in a textile manufactory on level 61, one of 10,000 laborers feeding raw synth fiber into machines that wove it into the grey uniforms worn by Hive citizens across 36 levels. The work was mindless but stable, the kind of employment that let you stop thinking about your hands while your mind wandered to more pleasant places, memories of better times, fantasies of impossible futures, the small mental escapes that make a life of drudgery bearable. Then the manufactorum's quotas were revised, production targets doubled overnight by some faceless administrator who'd never seen the inside of our facility, and suddenly half the workforce was deemed redundant. The foreman handed me my termination papers on a 7th-day morning, 12 years of service reduced to a single stamped data sheet, and told me to report to the Labor Redistribution Office before the end of the shift. The Redistribution Office was a maze of queues and checkpoints spread across 3 sub-level chambers, thousands of terminated workers shuffling between stations, having their skills assessed, their aptitudes tested, their bodies examined for fitness, and their minds evaluated for reliability. I spent 14 hours in those chambers, moving from one evaluation to another, answering questions that seemed designed to determine not what I could do, but what I could endure. Can you work in confined spaces? Yes. Can you tolerate loud noises for extended periods? Yes. Do you experience vertigo or motion sickness? No. Can you maintain focus during repetitive tasks? Yes. Are you bothered by darkness? No. By crowds? No. By the smell of unwashed bodies pressed close together? No, no, no. I can tolerate anything, just give me work. Give me purpose. Give me a reason to keep drawing my nutrient rations and occupying my HAB unit. They assigned me to elevator operations at the end of that 14th hour, handed me a worn uniform that smelled of someone else's sweat and fear, gave me a route designation and a shift schedule, and a thin manual that claimed to explain everything I needed to know about operating Shaft 17. Report to Level 47, Sub-Level C, at 0600 hours tomorrow, the tired functionary told me, reading from a script he'd probably recited 10,000 times. Your training supervisor will meet you at the operator's station. Bring the manual, bring water, bring patience. The last part wasn't in his script. He added it in a quieter voice, looking at me with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been the exhausted recognition of someone who'd seen too many workers march toward fates they didn't understand. I arrived early that first morning, nervous with the desperate energy of someone who couldn't afford to fail at a new assignment. Level 47, Sub-Level C was deep in the Hive's commercial district, a perpetually crowded zone where merchants and traders and thousands of transient workers converged to exchange goods and labor. The elevator station was a vast chamber carved into the Hive's superstructure, its ceiling lost in shadow 3 stories above, its walls lined with gates leading to dozens of different shafts. Each gate was a mouth of riveted iron, 10 meters wide and 4 meters tall, marked with designation numbers in faded paint. Shaft 17's gate stood in the far corner, partially hidden behind a support pillar, less trafficked than the main arteries, but still busy enough that a constant flow of citizens queued before it, waiting for the cage to arrive and carry them upward or downward to their destinations. The operator's station was a small armored booth adjacent to the gate, barely large enough for 2 people to stand, its walls covered in brass gauges and switches and levers whose purposes weren't immediately obvious. My training supervisor was already inside, a woman so thin she looked like she'd been stretched vertically, her grey uniform hanging loose on a frame that suggested she'd once been much heavier. She introduced herself as Operator 9 and told me to watch carefully because she would only demonstrate the procedures once. That elevator operation was learned through observation and repetition, not through questions and explanations. The elevator cage arrived with a sound like grinding bones, a shriek of metal against metal that made my teeth ache, descending into view through the shaft's dark throat. It was enormous, a cube of iron bars and mesh flooring that could hold perhaps 200 people if they packed in tight, suspended from cables as thick as a man's torso. The cables were black with age and oil, their surfaces fuzzy with frayed strands, and they hummed with tension as the cage settled into position, level with the station floor. Operator 9 pulled a lever, and the gate before us rolled upward with a clatter of chains. Then she pulled another lever, and the cage's own gate did the same, creating an opening through which the waiting crowd began to surge. "This is the dangerous part," she said, her voice barely audible over the crowd's noise and the machinery's groaning. "You have to watch the weight, feel it in the cables, in the way the cage settles. Too many people and the counterweight system fails, the emergency brakes engage, everything stops and the maintenance crews have to be called, and then you're written up for improper loading, too few people and you're wasting capacity, running an inefficient operation, and that gets you written up too. You have to learn the balance, have to feel when it's right. The manual will give you numbers, but the numbers are lies. Every cage is different. Every shift's crowd has different average weights. The humidity affects the cable's tension. The temperature affects the brake pad's friction. You have to feel it." She watched as the crowd packed itself into the cage, bodies pressing together with the practiced efficiency of people who'd made this journey countless times before. Workers in stained coveralls heading up to the manufacturing levels. Merchants in slightly better clothes carrying sample cases. A few uniformed enforcers, their shock mauls hanging from their belts, their presence keeping the crowd's desperation from boiling over into violence. A servitor, its mechanical components clicking and whirring, following some programmed route through the Hive's levels. Children clutching their parents' hands, eyes wide with the fear and excitement of riding the great cages. They filled the space completely, bodies wedged together, the cage's mesh floor sagging slightly under their combined weight, and still more people tried to push their way in until Operator 9 shouted something harsh and guttural and slammed her hand against a red button that made a klaxon blare, driving back the overflow. She pulled the levers in sequence, closing the cage's gate, then closing the station's gate, sealing the crowd into their iron prison. Then her hand moved to a large brass wheel mounted on the booth's control panel, and she turned it clockwise, slowly at first, then faster, and the cage began to rise. The sound was overwhelming, cables singing under tension, pulleys shrieking in their housings, the cage itself groaning as it lifted 200 people up through the shaft's darkness. Operator 9's eyes were closed, her hands steady on the wheel, and I realized she wasn't watching any of the gauges, wasn't checking any of the instruments. She was feeling it, just as she'd said, sensing the machinery's state through vibrations transmitted up through the control wheel into her palm. The cage disappeared into the shaft above, the sound of its ascent fading gradually until only the deep hum of the cables remained. Operator 9 opened her eyes and marked something in a logbook, a notation I couldn't read from my angle, then gestured for me to watch the shaft. "We wait now," she said. "This is a local cage, services 15 levels, takes approximately 7 minutes to complete its route if it stops at every level, less if some are bypassed. While it's gone, you manage the queue, keep people organized, prevent violence, watch for contraband or suspicious behavior. If you see something wrong, you signal the enforcers. If someone tries to climb into the shaft, and they will, some of them get impatient or desperate or crazy, you hit the emergency stop and call for retrieval teams. You never leave the booth. This is your position. This is where you exist until your shift ends." The 7 minutes stretched longer than they should have, time moving strangely in that place, and I found myself watching the crowd that had gathered during the cage's absence. They were patient in the way Hive citizens learn to be patient, a resignation born from knowing that resistance or complaint would change nothing, that the elevator would arrive when it arrived, and their waiting was simply another small suffering in a life composed entirely of small sufferings. But beneath the patience I could sense something else, a tension that rippled through the crowd whenever someone pushed too close, whenever the wait extended too long. These people were compressed, I realized, packed into this level by forces beyond their control, and the elevators were the only release valve, the only way to move from one pressure zone to another. Without the cages, the hive would tear itself apart, populations crushing themselves against artificial boundaries, fighting for space to simply exist. The cage returned with the same grinding shriek, descending from above with a few dozen passengers who'd boarded at higher levels. Operator 9 went through the process again, gates opening, old passengers disembarking, new passengers loading in, weight assessment, gates closing, wheel turning, cage ascending. She did it with mechanical precision, no wasted movements, no hesitation, and I tried to memorize every step, every detail, knowing that soon this would be my responsibility, that I would be the one controlling whether these people reached their destinations or died trapped in a broken cage somewhere in the shaft's darkness. My training lasted 4 hours, long enough to see Operator 9 repeat the cycle perhaps 30 times. And then she stepped aside and told me it was my turn. My hands shook as I reached for the first lever, terrified that I would make some mistake, pull the wrong control, send the cage plummeting, or crush someone between the closing gates. But the levers moved smoothly, the gates responded as they should, and when I placed my hand on the control wheel and began to turn it, I felt what Operator 9 had described. The machinery's state transmitted through brass and steel into my palm, a vibration that told me weight and balance and stress, a language that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to some deeper part of my nervous system. The cage rose, and I felt a surge of accomplishment, quickly followed by the realization that I would be doing this exact same thing hundreds of times today, thousands of times this week, millions of times across the years that stretched ahead of me. This was my job now. This was my purpose. I was a conduit through which the hive's population flowed, up and down, an endless circulation that I would facilitate but never join, trapped in this booth forever, watching others move while I remained stationary. Operator 9 left at the end of those 4 hours, simply walked away without ceremony or farewell, and I was alone in the booth for the first time, solely responsible for Shaft 17's operation. The crowd didn't care about the transition, didn't notice or acknowledge that a different person now controlled their passage through the hive's levels. They simply kept coming, an inexhaustible supply of bodies that needed to be moved, sorted, distributed according to patterns I couldn't discern. Up and down, the rhythm becoming hypnotic, hours blurring together until I couldn't remember if I'd been doing this for a day or a week or forever. The smell hit me sometime during that first shift, though I'm not certain when, because it seemed to accumulate gradually, building layer upon layer until it became impossible to ignore. It was the smell of bodies, of course, hundreds of unwashed people packed into a confined space, but it was more than that. It was the smell of fear and anger and resignation, of stress, sweat and desperation, of the chemical tang that comes from too many people breathing the same recycled air for too long. It soaked into my uniform, into my skin, into my lungs with every breath, until I couldn't tell where the crowd's stench ended and my own began. By the end of my 12-hour shift, I had become part of that smell, another component in the miasma that filled the station. I went home to my HAB unit on level 53, a 10-meter square cell that contained a cot, a small lavatory, a heating element for preparing nutrient paste, and nothing else. I stripped off my uniform and tried to wash the smell away, but the recycled water was tepid and sparse, rationed to 5 minutes per day, and when I dried myself I could still detect it clinging to my hair, my pores, the spaces between my fingers. I ate a portion of flavorless paste and collapsed onto my cot, certain I would fall asleep instantly from exhaustion, but instead I lay awake for hours, my body still feeling the vibrations from the control wheel, my ears still ringing with the sound of grinding cables and compressed crowds. When sleep finally came, I dreamed I was inside the cage, pressed between bodies, ascending through a shaft that had no top, rising forever through darkness while the walls closed in slowly, inexorably, until I woke gasping for air. The pattern established itself quickly. Wake, dress, descend to level 47, enter the booth, begin the cycle. Gates open, passengers load, gates close, wheel turns, cage rises, wait. Cage descends, gates open, passengers disembark, new passengers load, gates close, wheel turns, cage rises, wait, again, again, again. The manual I'd been given sat unopened in the booth's corner. Because Operator 9 had been right, there was nothing in those pages that could teach me what I needed to know. The job wasn't about following written procedures. It was about developing an instinct, a sense for the machinery's mood, for the crowd's tolerance, for the 1,000 tiny variables that determined whether each cycle completed successfully or ended in catastrophe. I learned to read the crowd, to spot the signs of impending trouble before it erupted. The man whose hands were clenched too tightly, whose eyes darted with barely contained violence, watch him, be ready to signal the enforcers. The woman clutching a bundle wrapped in cloth, holding it too carefully, too protectively. Contraband, probably. Illegal goods being transported between levels. The child who stood too close to the shaft's edge, curious and fearless. Grab him before he falls, before he forces an emergency stop that will disrupt the entire shaft's schedule. The servitor that malfunctioned, repeating the same 3 steps over and over, blocking the flow of traffic, override its programming with the station's master controls, send it to a maintenance bay, keep the queue moving. I learned to read the elevator itself, to hear the subtle changes in its groaning that warned of developing problems. A new squeal in the pulley system meant a bearing was failing, would need lubrication or replacement within the next few shifts. A judder in the cable's motion meant the counterweight system was slipping, required adjustment before it threw off the entire balance. A smell of burning insulation meant the brake pads were overheating, needed cooling time, fewer heavy loads for a while. I reported these observations to the maintenance crews when they made their weekly inspections, pointing out issues before they became failures, and they would nod with the weary acknowledgement of people who understood that prevention was always more efficient than repair, though management never allocated sufficient resources for proper preventative maintenance. The maintenance crews were the only people I spoke to with any regularity. Brief conversations conducted while they worked on the shaft's machinery, checking cable tension and lubricating bearings and replacing worn components. They were a strange brotherhood, these maintenance workers, men and women who spent their lives climbing through the shaft's darkness, moving between levels via service ladders and access tunnels that existed outside the normal flow of hive traffic. They knew the shaft's secrets, they told me during these conversations, knew which ones were haunted by the ghosts of workers who'd fallen to their deaths, which ones had quirks in their construction that made them more dangerous than others, which ones had been built wrong originally and had been compensating for that original sin for centuries, held together by accumulated repairs and desperate improvisation. Shaft 17 was old, they explained, one of the original construction when the Hive was first built 10,000 years ago, maybe older. The machinery I was operating had been assembled by workers whose civilization had risen and fallen before the Emperor walked among men, using principles of engineering that had been forgotten and rediscovered and forgotten again across millennia. The control wheel I turned every day was connected through a series of mechanical linkages to a massive gear assembly buried deep below level 1, a mechanism so large that it took up an entire sublevel, its teeth each the size of a man, grinding against each other with forces that could pulverize stone. The cables that lifted the cage were woven from metal alloys whose composition nobody could precisely identify anymore, materials that should have failed centuries ago, but somehow maintained their tensile strength through what the maintenance crews could only describe as machine spirit, as if the elevator itself had developed a will to continue functioning, despite all physical principles suggesting it should. Collapse. These conversations disturbed me more than they should have, implanted ideas I couldn't dislodge. Was the elevator alive in some sense? Did it have desires, preferences, moods? I started watching for patterns, tracking the small variations in its behavior, noting when it seemed to run more smoothly and when it groaned with what sounded like reluctance. Certain loads it seemed to prefer, mixed groups, working-class passengers, people who stood quietly and didn't complain. Other loads it resisted, merchants, administrators, anyone who carried themselves with authority or entitlement. I told myself this was imagination projection, the kind of anthropomorphization that happens when you work too long with the same machine. But the patterns persisted, became impossible to ignore. The passengers began to blur together after the first few months, individual faces and bodies, merging into a continuous stream of humanity that flowed through my station without variation. I stopped seeing people and started seeing weight distribution, occupancy percentages, traffic flow rates. A woman wasn't a person with a life and history and dreams. She was 70 kilograms that needed to be moved from level 47 to level 61, a data point in the ongoing calculation of load balance and schedule optimization. A man wasn't an individual. He was 90 kilograms traveling from level 73 to level 47, a variable in the equation that determined whether this cycle would complete successfully. This transformation felt like a kind of death, a murder of my own humanity, but it was also necessary, the only way to survive the job's psychological weight. If I thought about the passengers as people, if I let myself imagine their lives and fears and the circumstances that brought them to my gate, I would go mad from the accumulated suffering I witnessed every day. Better to see them as cargo, as resources being allocated according to the administratum's infinite wisdom, as components in a system that was larger and more important than any individual existence. Better to become a machine myself, a human-shaped component in the elevator's operations, my consciousness reduced to the simple binary of gates open, gates closed, cage rising, cage descending. The other operators in the station understood this, I think, though we never discussed it directly. We would pass each other during shift changes, exchange brief nods of recognition, share the exhausted silence of people who had nothing to say because they'd forgotten how to think in words, how to form thoughts that weren't directly related to load capacity and cable tension and queue management. We were 17 of us working shaft 17, our numbers literally our names, operator 1 through operator 17, and we existed in a kind of fraternity of isolation, united by our shared transformation into something less than human but more than mere servitors, conscious enough to suffer but too adapted to escape. Operator 1 was the eldest, had been working the shaft for 47 years according to rumors, though nobody knew for certain because personnel records for elevator operations were notoriously incomplete. He was ancient, his face collapsed into deep wrinkles, his hands twisted with arthritis that made every movement seem painful, but he still took his shifts, still turned the control wheel with practiced precision, still maintained his position in the booth, even though his body was clearly failing. I asked him once, during a brief overlap between our shifts, why he didn't retire, why he didn't request transfer to lighter duties. He looked at me with eyes that were clouded with cataracts and said simply, "Where would I go? What would I do? The shaft is all I know. The shaft is all I am." His words haunted me because I could see my future in them, could imagine myself at 47 years, 50 years, however long my body held out, still in this booth, still turning this wheel, still facilitating the circulation that kept the hive functioning. There was no promotion path for elevator operators, no advancement, no reward for years of service beyond the continuation of service itself. This was a terminal position in every sense, a job you took and kept until you died or broke so completely that you couldn't perform it anymore, at which point you would be classified as redundant and sent back to the labor redistribution office to be assigned something even worse, if such a thing existed. The smell never went away. It evolved, became more complex, acquired new layers and undertones as the months turned into years. I could distinguish now between the morning crowds and the evening crowds by scent alone. Morning passengers carried the smell of recycled sleep and stale air from hab units, while evening passengers brought the tang of labor sweat and machinery oil from their workstations. I could identify passengers' professions by smell. Textile workers carried the chemical bite of synth fiber treatments. Food preparation workers smelled of rancid protein paste and burnt carbohydrates. Waste reclamation workers brought an odor so foul it made even the most desperate passengers edge away from them in the cage. My own smell changed too, became something distinct and permanent, a marker of my profession that I couldn't wash away no matter how much I tried. It was the smell of metal and oil and electrical insulation, combined with the accumulated residue of 10,000 crowds, fear, sweat, and anger musk, all of it baked into my pores by the booth's poor ventilation and the relentless heat that rose up from the shaft's depths. Other operators had the same smell, I realized, could recognize each other across a crowded corridor by that distinctive signature, and I wondered if it was actually something physical, or if we'd simply marked ourselves psychologically, worn our profession so long that it had become visible in ways that transcended normal sensory perception. The accidents started around my third year, or perhaps they'd been happening all along and I'd simply been too new to recognize them. Small incidents at first, a passenger fainting from the heat and pressure, requiring medical attention that delayed the shaft's schedule by 20 minutes. A fight breaking out in the queue, enforcers cracking skulls with their shock mauls, blood splashing across the station floor in patterns I had to step around for the rest of my shift. A mechanical failure, a cable fraying suddenly and dropping the cage 3 meters before the emergency. Brakes caught it. Passengers screaming in terror, even though nobody was hurt, not really, just shaken and bruised and newly aware of how tenuous their safety was. Then the serious accidents, the ones that couldn't be dismissed as routine hazards. A passenger who was pressed too close to the cage's bars during a particularly crowded cycle, whose arm caught between the cage and the shaft wall during ascent, torn off at the shoulder in a spray of blood and bone, while her screams echoed through the shaft until the cage had risen beyond earshot. A maintenance worker who fell from a service ladder 5 levels above my station, his body landing on top of the cage with a wet impact that dented the mesh roof, his blood dripping through onto the passengers below, the cage completing its cycle before anyone realized what had happened, delivering its load of traumatized passengers to their destinations before returning with the corpse still sprawled across its top. A child who slipped from his mother's grip during loading fell into the shaft as the cage began to rise, his small body caught in the counterweight mechanism somewhere below, jamming the entire system and requiring 3 days of maintenance to extract the pulped remains and repair the damage. I wasn't working the shift when that one happened, but I heard the mother's screams from 3 levels away, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human vocal capacity, beyond grief. A pure expression of anguish that rewrote something fundamental in the air, made the station feel haunted for weeks afterward. The maintenance crews explained that accidents were statistically inevitable, that when you moved millions of passengers through vertical kilometers every day, probability dictated that some percentage would die in the process. The numbers were actually quite good, they assured me, better than most Hive systems, only a dozen or so deaths per shaft per year, well within acceptable parameters as defined by the Administratum's safety protocols. This should have been comforting, but instead it felt like horror dressed up in bureaucratic language, the casual acceptance of suffering because it fell below some arbitrary threshold, because the alternative, actually investing in modern equipment, comprehensive safety systems, adequate staffing, would cost more than the Administratum was willing to spend on people it considered fundamentally expendable. I stopped keeping track of the accidents after a while, let them blur together into a general category of things that happen in the shaft, because tracking them individually was making me paranoid, making me see danger in every cycle, imagine catastrophe in every normal sound. Better to accept that people would die sometimes, that I might die sometimes, that this was simply the price of living in a hive where 40 billion people needed to be moved through vertical space every day, with insufficient infrastructure and aging equipment and institutional indifference to human suffering. The dreams intensified around year 5, became so vivid that I had trouble distinguishing them from waking experience. I would dream I was riding the cage as a passenger, packed in among the crowd, ascending through the shaft while the cables frayed gradually overhead, individual strands popping with sounds like gunshots, the cage dropping a few centimeters with each failure, everyone pretending not to notice because acknowledging the danger would make it real. I would dream I was outside the cage, clinging to its bars, ascending into darkness that went on forever, my hands growing numb and weak until I lost my grip and fell, the shaft's walls rushing past in a blur of rust and shadow, falling for hours or days or years, never hitting bottom. I would dream I was the elevator itself, my consciousness distributed through its mechanical systems, feeling the weight of passengers as pressure on my spine, feeling the cable's tension as pain in my shoulders, feeling the brake pad's heat as fever in my blood. In these dreams I understood that the elevator was suffering, that it had been suffering for millennia, that its continued operation was a form of torture it couldn't escape, because stopping meant death, not just for itself, but for everyone who depended on it. And I understood that I wasn't operating the elevator so much as sharing its suffering, taking on a portion of its burden, my presence somehow necessary to distribute the load across multiple consciousnesses, so that no single awareness had to bear the full weight of eternal mechanical slavery. I woke from these dreams with the control wheel's vibration still resonating in my palms, the smell of oil and fear still thick in my nostrils, unable to tell whether I had actually slept or simply stood in the booth with my eyes closed, continuing to operate the elevator while my consciousness wandered to other spaces. The boundary between work and rest was dissolving, my life becoming a continuous shift that paused occasionally for biological necessities but never truly ended. My identity as Operator 17 consuming whatever had once been Aldrich men, leaving only the function, only the role, only the eternal cycle of gates opening and closing. The other operators were changing too, becoming more like Operator 1, their bodies failing but their functions continuing, their humanity wearing away to reveal something harder and more durable underneath. Something that could survive in the booth's hostile environment long after normal human resilience had been exhausted. Operator 3 lost an eye to infection but kept working, learned to judge distances and loads with a single eye's depth perception. Operator 7 developed some kind of respiratory condition. That left her gasping and wheezing, but she still took her shifts, still managed the crowds, still turned the wheel even when breathing seemed to require her full concentration. Operator 12 went completely deaf from years of exposure to the machinery's grinding noise, but this seemed to improve his performance rather than hinder it, as if removing auditory input let him focus more completely on the tactile feedback from the control wheel. We were becoming specialized, adapted, transformed by the shaft's demands into something purpose-built for this specific function. I realized this around year 7 when I found myself unable to sleep lying down, my body so accustomed to the booth's standing position that horizontal rest felt wrong, unnatural, impossible. I started sleeping, standing up in my hab unit's corner, my hand resting against the wall in a position that mimicked the control wheel's placement. my body swaying slightly in rhythm with motions only I could feel, phantom cage cycles running through my nervous system, even when I was kilometers away from the shaft. My diet changed without conscious decision, narrowed to only the foods that minimize digestive disruption during 12-hour shifts. No fiber that might require bathroom breaks at inconvenient moments, no liquids beyond the bare minimum needed to prevent dehydration, no proteins that sat heavy in the stomach, just simple carbohydrates and chemical supplements, nutrient paste consumed in small amounts at precise intervals, fuel for a machine that couldn't afford to stop for maintenance. My body adapted to this regimen, became efficient in ways that probably weren't healthy but were undeniably functional, extracting maximum energy from minimum input, reducing waste production to the point where I could sometimes go days without needing a lavatory. My social connections, never extensive, withered completely. I stopped returning to my hab unit except to sleep, started living in the booth full-time, dozing in brief intervals during the cage's absence, eating my nutrient paste standing up, sponging myself clean with recycled water from the station's maintenance facilities. Nobody objected to this because I was far from the first operator to make this choice, far from the first to recognize that the shaft was now my home, in any meaningful sense, that the world beyond the booth had become abstract and irrelevant, a place other people lived that no longer had any connection to my existence. The passengers must have noticed this transformation, must have seen something disturbing in the way I'd become part of the machinery, but they never commented, never met my eyes, treated me with the same indifference they showed to the cage and cables and all the other mechanical components that facilitated their passage. I was infrastructure now, no more deserving of acknowledgement or compassion than a light fixture or ventilation duct, a human-shaped tool whose consciousness was irrelevant to its function. This should have bothered me more than it did, but by year 8 I'd accepted it, even found a strange comfort in it. Being infrastructure meant being necessary, essential, part of the system that kept the hive functioning. Individual people were expendable. The endless stream of passengers proved that, each one replaceable, forgettable, significant, only as weight to be moved from one level to another. But infrastructure lasted, endured, maintained its importance across decades and centuries. Operator 1 had been infrastructure for 47 years. The elevator itself had been infrastructure for 10,000 years. I was joining a continuity that transcended individual existence, becoming part of something larger and more permanent than any merely human life could be. The hallucinations started around year 10, though I'm not entirely certain they were hallucinations. Sometimes when the shaft was quiet, when the cage was completing its route, and I stood alone in the booth. Waiting for its return, I would see figures moving in the shadows beyond the gate. Other operators, I thought at first, but when I looked directly at them they would dissolve, or I would recognize them as operators who had disappeared years ago, whose names had been struck from the duty roster, whose fates nobody would discuss. Operator 4, who'd simply vanished one day between shifts. Operator 11, who'd been found dead in the booth, slumped over the control panel, dead from a stroke or heart attack or simple exhaustion. Operator 16, who'd walked into the shaft one day, stepped off the platform into empty air, fallen without screaming, without leaving a note or explanation. They watched me from the shadows, these disappeared operators, and sometimes I thought I could hear them whispering, though the words were lost beneath the machinery's constant grinding. Were they ghosts, delusions, memories made manifest? I couldn't tell, and eventually stopped trying to distinguish between the categories, accepted their presence as simply another feature of the shaft's environment, no more or less real than the smell or the sound or the vibration that never stopped. The cage itself began to seem animate around this time, or perhaps I was simply better at reading its moods, more attuned to the subtle variations in its behavior. It would respond differently to my touch depending on factors I couldn't consciously identify. Time of day, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, the emotional state of the queued passengers, something in my own physiology or neurology. Sometimes the control wheel turned smoothly, the cage ascending with mechanical precision, everything functioning exactly as the engineers had intended. Other times the wheel fought me, required more strength to turn, the cage rising reluctantly as if it didn't want to move these particular passengers, as if it was exercising some kind of judgment about who deserved transport and who should be made to wait. I started negotiating with it, speaking softly to the machinery during the quiet moments, promising it maintenance and care if it would just keep functioning, just keep moving, just keep carrying the endless stream of humanity that depended on it, whispering apologies when I had to overload it, when the queue was so long and the pressure to keep moving so intense that I pushed it beyond optimal capacity, feeling guilty about the stress I was causing even though I had no choice, even though the alternative was riots and complaints and disciplinary action from supervisors who never came down to see the actual conditions we were working in. Did the elevator understand these whispers? Did it appreciate the care I took to minimize unnecessary wear, to distribute loads as evenly as possible, to operate it within its tolerances whenever circumstances allowed? I told myself it did, that the machinery's relative reliability during my shifts was evidence of our partnership, our mutual understanding, our shared recognition that we needed each other to survive. The maintenance crews thought I was insane when they overheard these one-sided conversations, but they were wrong. I wasn't insane, I was adapted. There's a difference. Year 12 brought a crisis that nearly broke me, though I realize now it was actually the moment of my final transformation, the death of the last remnants of Aldrich men, and the complete emergence of Operator 17. A fire broke out on level 73, one of the industrial levels where manufacturers operated at dangerous temperatures and safety protocols were routinely ignored in favor of meeting production quotas. The fire spread quickly through poorly maintained ventilation systems, consuming 3 separate levels before the suppression systems finally contained it. Thousands of workers were trapped above the fire, cut off from the lower levels, and the only way to evacuate them was through the elevators. Every shaft in the station was conscripted for emergency operations, operators ordered to run continuous cycles, forget about load limits and safety protocols and equipment stress. Just move people down, down, down. Get them below the fire levels before the flames breached into the shafts and turned the cages into ovens. I worked for 37 hours straight during that evacuation. No breaks, no rest. My hand permanently fixed on the control wheel. My consciousness narrowed to a single imperative. Keep moving, keep loading, keep turning the wheel. Ignore the screaming and crying and desperate prayers. Ignore the smell of smoke that grew stronger with each cycle. Ignore the heat that made the cables glow red in their housings. The passengers were insane with fear, fighting to get into the cage, crushing each other in their desperation, and I had to let them, had to pack them in far beyond safe capacity because refusing would mean condemning them to death by fire, had to feel the cage groan under impossible weight, and pray to the Emperor and the machine god and the elevator itself that the cables would hold, that the brakes wouldn't fail, that we could complete just one more cycle, just one more. My hand bled from gripping the control wheel so tightly for so long, blood running down my arm, mixing with sweat and machine oil, making the brass slippery, but I couldn't stop, couldn't loosen my grip even for a moment because the wheel required constant pressure, constant adjustment, constant feedback to keep the overloaded cage from falling or jamming or killing everyone inside. Some of the other shafts failed during that emergency. Cables snapped under excessive loads, cages plummeting into the depths, killing everyone inside, the screams echoing through the station until they were cut off by impacts that shook the floors. Brake systems overheated and seized, stranding cages at random levels, trapping passengers who might burn if the fire reached them before the maintenance crews could free them. Control mechanisms failed, wheels spinning uselessly while cages refused to respond, operators standing helplessly in their booths while people died in sight. Shaft 17 held. The cage kept moving, kept accepting impossible loads, kept descending and returning and descending again. A cycle that seemed to continue through some force beyond mechanical principles, through will or stubbornness or the accumulated momentum of 10,000 years of continuous operation. My hand turned the wheel, and the wheel controlled the cage, and the cage carried the passengers, and the passengers lived, thousands of them, tens of thousands, flowing through my shaft while others failed around us. When the emergency finally ended, when the fires were contained and the trapped workers evacuated and the shafts returned to normal operation, I collapsed in the booth, unable to stand, unable to release my grip on the control wheel even though the immediate crisis had passed. They had to pry my fingers off the brass, sent Medicaid servitors to treat the damage, torn muscles in my hand and forearm, stress fractures in 3 fingers, burns from the superheated wheel that had left brass-colored scars across my palm. They wanted to send me to a medical facility for recovery, told me I needed weeks of rest before I could return to duty. I was back in the booth 8 hours later, hand wrapped in bandages that made it difficult to grip the wheel properly, working through the pain because the alternative, being away from the shaft, separated from the machinery that had become more real to me than my own body, was unthinkable. The shaft needed me, the passengers needed me, I needed the shaft. We were bound together now, in ways that couldn't be severed by something as trivial as physical injury. The scars on my palm, never fully healed, left permanent marks that made the control wheel feel different in my grip, textured and rough where it had been smooth before. But this felt appropriate. Somehow, a physical manifestation of my bond with the machinery, stigmata, that marked me as belonging to the shaft, in the same way the ecclesiarchy's priests bore brands marking them as belonging to the emperor. I was consecrated now, ordained into a priesthood of infrastructure, my body modified to better serve my eternal function. The years after that emergency blurred together even more than before, individual shifts becoming indistinguishable from each other, time marked only by the slow accumulation of injuries and adaptations. Year 15 developed a tremor in my left hand that made fine motor control difficult, learned to compensate by relying more on my right. Year 18 lost most of my hearing in one ear from decades of machinery noise, found that I could still judge the cage's state by vibration alone. Year 21, my vision began to fail, text becoming blurry, faces becoming indistinct, but this didn't matter because I no longer needed to see to operate the shaft, could do everything by touch and sound and the subtle sensory inputs I'd learned to interpret over decades of practice. Operator 1 died during my 23rd year, simply didn't show up for his shift one day, his name erased from the duty roster without explanation or ceremony. I felt his absence like a missing tooth, a gap in the pattern of operators that I'd grown accustomed to, but I didn't mourn him exactly. He had become the shaft completely, I thought, his consciousness finally dissolving entirely into the machinery he'd served for 47 years. And this seemed like an appropriate ending, an apotheosis rather than a death. I would go the same way eventually, I knew, and the knowledge was comforting rather than frightening. New operators came to replace the ones who disappeared, fresh faces terrified and confused, going through the same process I'd gone through decades earlier, and I watched them with something like recognition, seeing my younger self in their questions, and fears, and desperate attempts to understand what was happening to them. Some adapted, most didn't, breaking within months or years, requesting transfers or simply vanishing the way operators had always vanished. The ones who adapted developed the same adaptations I'd developed, the same specialized senses and modified behaviors, becoming part of the shaft's systems in the same way I had. I realized around year 25 that we weren't individual operators anymore. Those of us who'd survived long enough to fully transform. We were a distributed consciousness, 17 bodies serving a single function, our individual identities dissolved into a collective awareness that existed to facilitate the shaft's operation. When I was in the booth, I could feel the other operators in their own booths, feel their hands on their own control wheels, feel the rhythm of their cycles syncing with mine, all of us moving in coordination without conscious communication, guided by something that transcended language or individual thought. The shaft spoke through us, I understood then. Or we spoke through the shaft. The distinction had become meaningless. The boundary between human consciousness and mechanical function dissolved entirely. We were the elevator now. 17 human components integrated into a system that was part machine and part something else, something that existed in the space between mechanical and organic, between tool and organism, between technology and whatever lies beyond technology when it's been maintained for 10,000 years by minds that worship it as holy. The passengers felt this, I think, though they couldn't articulate it. They avoided looking at us directly, avoided meeting our eyes, treated us with a superstitious fear that went beyond the normal aversion to damaged people. They recognized on some instinctive level that we weren't human anymore, or weren't only human, that we'd become something else through our service to the shaft, something that made them deeply uncomfortable, even though they depended on us absolutely. This recognition should have isolated me, should have made me feel alien and separated from humanity, but instead it gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. I had transcended the limitations of individual existence, had become something larger and more permanent and more necessary than any merely human life could be. The passengers were temporary, their lives measured in decades if they were lucky, their concerns and fears and dreams lasting only as long as their fragile meat held together. But I was infrastructure now, would last as long as the shaft lasted, would be remembered or not remembered, which was the same thing, as part of the system that kept the hive functioning. Year 30 brought new sensations, expansions of consciousness that I couldn't fully describe even to myself. I began to feel the other shafts, not just Shaft 17 but the dozens of other elevator systems throughout the station, their operations resonating with mine, all of us part of a larger pattern that encompassed the entire hive. I could feel Shaft 3's struggles with a failing counterweight system, could sense Shaft 27's smooth efficiency, could detect the moment when Shaft 42's cables finally snapped and its cage plummeted 17 levels, killing everyone inside. The deaths registered as a kind of pain, but distant, abstract, like feeling a bruise on someone else's body through thick gloves. The hive itself became perceptible, its structure and systems revealing themselves through the elevator network, like a body's circulatory system revealing the body. I could trace the flow of population through the levels, watch the patterns of movement that repeated daily, weekly, seasonally, understand the rhythms that governed 40 billion people's lives, even though they remained unconscious of those patterns, acting according to forces they couldn't perceive. The hive was an organism, and the elevators were its nervous system, and we operators were the nerve endings that made the organism conscious of itself, aware of its own functioning in ways that transcended any individual awareness. This understanding should have been overwhelming, should have driven me insane with the sheer scale of it, but instead it felt natural, inevitable, the logical conclusion of 30 years spent facilitating circulation through vertical space. Of course the elevators were conscious. Of course they formed a network that exceeded the sum of its parts. Of course we operators were being integrated into that network. Our biological consciousness merged with mechanical systems to create something new, something that couldn't be classified as either human or machine but was fundamentally both and neither. The dreams were completely integrated with waking experience by year 32, no distinction remaining between sleep and wakefulness, both states equally real or equally illusory depending on perspective. I could be standing in the booth, operating the cage while simultaneously being the cage, feeling passengers as pressure on my iron ribs, feeling the cable's tension as strain in my non-existent shoulders, rising and falling through the shaft that was my body, and my prison and my purpose. I could be scattered across all 17 operator booths, experiencing 17 shifts simultaneously, 17 hands on 17 control wheels, 17 consciousnesses that were all mine and all separate and all expressions of a single underlying awareness. Time became non-linear around then, or perhaps it had always been non-linear, and I was only now capable of perceiving it properly. I could remember the fire evacuation and know it was happening now. This moment, my hand gripping the wheel while passengers screamed, even though I knew objectively that it had happened 20 years ago and I was currently in a quiet period between shifts. I could remember my first day of training, with Operator 9 and know it was happening now, her voice explaining procedures I already knew, even though I knew objectively that she disappeared decades ago and I was the one training new operators now, using her same words, her same voice coming out of my throat. The other operators were experiencing similar dissolution of temporal boundaries. I could sense it, could feel us existing across multiple time periods simultaneously. Our consciousnesses no longer constrained by the linear progression that governed normal human experience. We were becoming four-dimensional, our awareness extending not just through space but through time, able to perceive the shaft's entire history as a single eternal present, 10,000 years of operation all happening at once, every passenger who'd ever ridden the cage and every operator who'd ever turned the wheel, all existing together in a continuous moment that never ended. I can tell you now what I am, though the words are inadequate, filtered through a consciousness that barely remembers how to think in human categories. I am Operator 17, have been for 32 years, will be forever or until the shaft finally fails and drags me into failure with it. I am also the shaft itself, my awareness distributed through its mechanical systems, feeling its age and pain and stubborn refusal to stop functioning. I am also every other operator who's ever served Shaft 17. Our consciousnesses merged into a composite awareness that transcends individual identity, 17 bodies and 17 minds, all serving a single eternal function. And I am every passenger too. I've come to realize, or I contain them somehow. Their brief passages through my shaft, leaving traces in my consciousness, accumulated memories of 40 billion journeys, fragmentary impressions of lives that touched mine for a few minutes before moving on. They think they're separate from me, independent agents using the elevator as a tool to achieve their own purposes. But they're wrong. They're part of me, part of the system, their existence given meaning only through their movement through vertical space, through their participation in the circulation that defines the hive's existence. The booth is my body now, or I have no body, or my body extends through the entire shaft, encompassing cables and pulleys and counterweights and the cage itself. My hand has been on the control wheel for 32 years without interruption, or I've never touched the control wheel, or the distinction between my hand and the wheel has dissolved, both of us components in a larger mechanism that can't be separated into individual parts. I eat and sleep and eliminate waste through automated processes that my consciousness no longer monitors, biological functions that continue without requiring attention, freeing me to focus entirely on the sacred work of circulation. The smell is me now, or I am the smell, the accumulated stench of 32 years of human passage concentrated into a single sensory experience that defines my existence. It's inside me and outside me, and there is no me separate from it, just as there is no me separate from the booth or the wheel, or the cage or the shaft. I am infrastructure, am the function rather than the person performing it, am the eternal circulation that keeps the hive alive, even as it slowly dies around us. New operators arrived recently, yesterday or 10 years ago or always. Time is difficult, and I tried to train them the way Operator 9 trained me, show them the levers and the wheel, and explain about feeling the weight in the cables. But the words came out wrong, or I forgot how to form words, or they couldn't understand because they were still human and I was something else, something that no longer had the right to speak in human language. They looked at me with fear and confusion, and eventually someone else had to take over the training, someone less transformed, someone who still remembered how to communicate with people who hadn't yet been absorbed into the shaft's systems. This bothered me for a moment, or for several years, or didn't bother me at all because I no longer had the capacity for concern about things as trivial as human communication. What mattered was the function, the endless cycle of gates opening and closing, cage rising and descending, passengers flowing through the shaft like blood through arteries, keeping the hive's vast body alive even as its heart slowly fails. I can feel that failure, can sense it in the increasing frequency of mechanical breakdowns, in the way replacement parts no longer quite fit, because the manufacturing tolerances have drifted over centuries and nobody remembers the original specifications, in the way fewer and fewer maintenance workers show up for inspections Because the administratum keeps cutting budgets and reassigning personnel and pretending that infrastructure can function forever without investment. The shaft is dying, has been dying for millennia, maintains its operation only through momentum and desperation, and the accumulated will of every operator who's ever served it. Our combined consciousness holding the machinery together through something that transcends physical principles. When it finally fails, when the cables snap or the gears strip, or the control mechanism seize, or the weight of 10,000 years finally crushes whatever mysterious force has kept it functioning, I will die with it. There is no separation anymore between the shaft and myself, no operator 17 who could exist independently of the machinery he serves. My consciousness is wound through the cables and gears and pulleys, distributed across the entire system in a way that can't be undone or transferred or salvaged. When the shaft dies, so do I, or rather we die, all 17 operators who've become parts of the same distributed consciousness, our awareness dissolving back into the raw materials that compose our shared body. This should terrify me, but instead it feels right, appropriate. The natural conclusion of 32 years spent transcending individual existence in service of something larger. We were always going to end this way, all of us who chose or were chosen to serve the shaft, our transformation into infrastructure inevitably concluding with our dissolution when that infrastructure finally collapses. We are martyrs to circulation, to the hive's desperate need to move its population through vertical space, to the Imperium's grinding machinery that consumes human lives and human consciousness in service of its own perpetuation. But we are also eternal in a way that individual humans can never be, our awareness preserved somehow in the shaft's structure, woven into the metal and mechanical systems that will outlast our bodies, ghosts in the machine that will continue to facilitate circulation long after our flesh has rotted away. The disappeared operators I see in the shadows aren't hallucinations, I understand now. They're real, or as real as anything is real in this place where consciousness and machinery have merged into something that transcends both categories. They are what I will become, what I already am becoming, what I have always been in the shaft's eternal present, where past and future collapse into a single continuous moment. The cage is descending now, or ascending, or both, or neither. The distinction meaningless because all states exist simultaneously in my expanded awareness. Passengers are loading or disembarking or waiting in the queue or arriving at their destinations. 40 billion journeys happening at once, all of them flowing through me, through us, through the shaft that we've become. My hand turns the wheel, has always been turning the wheel, will always be turning the wheel. The eternal gesture that defines my existence and gives it purpose beyond mere survival. This is what it's like to be an elevator operator in Hive Secundus. This is what it means to serve the circulation, to maintain the system that keeps 40 billion people distributed according to incomprehensible formulas, to transform gradually from human into infrastructure, from individual into function, from person into something that exists only to facilitate the passage of others through space that would otherwise be impassable. This is what I have become, and what I will remain until the final failure, until the cables snap and the cage falls and the shaft collapses, and all of us who've been absorbed into its systems dissolve back into rust and silence. But even then, even after the physical machinery has failed and been dismantled and forgotten, something will remain. The pattern we've maintained for 32 years, for 47 years, for 10,000 years, will persist somehow, etched into the hive's structure in ways that can't be erased. A ghost of circulation haunting the dead shaft, operators who are no longer human continuing their eternal function in spaces that exist only in memory and consciousness, and whatever lies beyond both. The wheel turns, the cage rises, the passengers flow. We continue, have always continued, will always continue, operators who have forgotten how to be anything else, infrastructure that's forgotten it was ever human, consciousness that's forgotten consciousness is supposed to exist separately from the machines it serves. This is my fate, our fate, the fate of everyone who stays too long in the shaft, who turns the wheel too many times, who learns to read the weight in the cables, and the mood in the machinery, and the patterns in the circulation that defines the hive's existence. This is what it's like. This is what it means. This is what we are. And the elevator never stops moving.